counsel. You may continue.
Judge, I'm sorry, can we approach before we begin?
Yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen seated in the back of the courtroom, please make sure that all of your electronic equipment has been turned off unless you have specific permission to have it on. All right, you may proceed.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Samuels, we stopped just when we started to talk about PTSD. Can we talk about the criteria, the general criteria for a PTSD?
Yes. The criteria are actually fairly specific. And I'd like to just read them from the book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Accuracy.
All right, and that's the DSM-4.
This is the DSM-4.
Can you tell us on the green tag what number it is?
Yes, it has been entered as Exhibit 528.
Okay, it's marked as Exhibit 528. All right, go ahead, and you're going to tell us what the specific criteria are for PTSD.
Okay, so when you go through these criteria, they're very, very specific. And so you compare these criteria to what you have learned from interview, from the crime scene reports, if you're dealing with a criminal case, from the psychological testing and so forth. The person has been exposed to a traumatic event in which both of the following were present. 1, the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or threat to the physical integrity of self or others, period. 2, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And then they go on to explain for children it's a little different, but that's not relevant here.
All right.
B,
go ahead.
the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in one or more of the following ways. So of the 5 that I'll read, at least one of them has to be present. Recurrent or intrusive distressing recollections of the event, including images, thoughts, or perceptions. 2, recurrent distressing dreams of the event. 3, acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were reoccurring, includes a sense of reliving the experience, illusions, hallucinations, and dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur on awakening or when intoxicated. 4, intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. And 5, psychological reactivity on exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. But that's not all. C.
Wait, I'm sorry, let me ask you.
Okay.
So one of those things has to be present?
At least one of those things has to be present.
Okay, and then another criteria?
C. Persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma is indicated by 3 or more of the following, and there are 7.
Okay.
Efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. 2, efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. 3, inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. 4, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. 5, feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. 6, restricted range of affect, e.g., unable to have loving feelings. 7, a sense of a foreshortened future. Example, does not expect to have a career, marriage, children, or a normal lifespan. And finally, D, 2 or more of the following, and there are 5. Persistent symptoms of increased arousal not present before the trauma, as indicated by 2 or more of the following. 1, difficulty falling or staying asleep. 2, irritability or outbursts of anger. 3, difficulty concentrating. 4, hypervigilance. 5, exaggerated startle response. So you go through these criteria and you compare that to the picture that's presented by the client, either through interview, other police records, et cetera, any psychiatric material if you have it, test results, and so forth.
Okay. And this is this something that psychologists anywhere, if they were looking at a patient, they would be relying on these particular criteria?
That's correct.
All right. And with regard to PTSD, let's talk about your specific diagnosis then. What's specific to Jodi? Mm-hmm. Okay. And for that, do you need to refer to your report?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell us what's the exhibit number on that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What's the exhibit number on your report?
What page?
Exhibit number.
Oh, exhibit number.
The green
I'm sorry. It's over here. 525.
Okay. And so the report, and you would take what you've learned about Miss Arias, if I understand this correctly.
Yes.
And compare it to the criteria in DSM.
That's correct.
All right. And the information that you learned from Miss Arias is coming from multiple sources, is that right?
Yes.
So is it more than what she told you?
Yes.
And also based on the testing that you did?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the criteria. What's the first criteria that you found that relates to Miss Arias?
Hold on. Take me a second to get there. Criteria A1, which is as follows. The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or others.
Okay. And how does that relate to Miss Arias?
Well, she was involved in a homicide, and we have some data to show that perpetrators of violent crimes will frequently develop post-traumatic stress disorder from having been the initiator of such an event. We see that also in soldiers and police officers.
All right. And we'll talk about that in a second. So that's how you relate A1 to Miss Arias?
Yes.
Okay. What's the next criteria?
A2. The person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror.
Okay. And how does that relate to Miss Arias?
In describing her experiences, what she could remember, and the very fact that her defense mechanisms were built up so strongly that she couldn't confront the reality of what she did, I consider criteria A2 as having been met.
And what are you talking about that her defense mechanisms were built up so strongly? What are you talking
Well, I have a psychological theory as to describe why the story was created.
The intruder story?
The intruder story.
And then the story before that she wasn't there at all?
That's right.
Okay. And what's your psychological theory?
Well, we call it denial. It's a very intense form of denial where a person cannot deal with the fact that something they did was so opposite of everything else they stood for in life. I determined that by reading her diaries, primarily. And in her diaries, she is essentially a pacifist. And not a violent word, not a negative word. I didn't come across one negative word, statement, violent thought, or hostile thought in any of all of these writings that I read.
And let me just be specific. In these writings that you talk about, these are not just writings starting from 2006 to 2008, right?
These go back to either junior high or high school.
Okay. And so when you're talking about not a violent thought or things like that, is that also true for the writings that begin when she was a teenager?
Yes.
All right. And so how does that then help you to give us A2?
When a person engages in an activity that is the opposite of what they stand for, the horror of that all, the inability to accept what has happened, can create in one's mind a psychological wall between them and the reality of what happened. And that can occur by either denial that they were there or that it actually happened, and there was evidence that she pretended it didn't happen, or making up a story that was just the opposite of what happened to distance herself from that.
Okay.
So that, to me, met criteria too.
All right. And is that making up a story, is that what we're talking about with the intruder or what she originally told Detective Flores?
Yes, she could not deal with the fact that she had done it.
All right. And in fact, when she, according to your information, it took several years, didn't it, before she could admit to herself what had happened?
Yes, it did.
All right. And is that something, that psychologically speaking, is that the defense mechanism still holding up that long?
That's not unusual at all. Some people go through life with a defense mechanism impeding their lives. But it took Mr. Nurmi and I a couple of visits, actually, to help her get through that, to break down that barrier. And if you looked at it from the perspective of therapy, it would have been considered a therapeutic breakthrough.
Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next criteria.
B3. Acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were reoccurring includes a sense of reliving the experience, illusions, hallucinations, and dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur on awakening or when intoxicated. She reported experiencing a number of intrusive thoughts and memories, either sometimes during the day or at night in her dreams.
What do you mean by intrusive thoughts?
Thoughts of Travis, thoughts of Mr. Alexander, thoughts of good times they had, thoughts of some of the bad times they had. And these thoughts would pop into her mind, and it was hard for her to shut them down.
Okay.
So that to me met the criteria for C3.
All right. So when you talk about intrusive thoughts, you're not talking about her having memories of what actually happened on June 4th.
No, because she doesn't have those memories.
Okay. And so when you say she doesn't have those memories, what do you mean?
That the acute stress condition that she was in precluded the hippocampus from forming those memories, and they're not available for recall.
So are they ever able to be recalled?
Probably not. If they don't come back within a reasonable period of time, it's not likely they will. And some amnesias remain permanent,
Okay.
and that's not unusual.
All right. And so when you talk about these intrusive thoughts, then it's more about her relationship with Travis?
Yes, the various aspects of the relationship with him.
Okay. And the fact that they're labeled intrusive thoughts, does that mean that she's not able to shut them down?
That's correct.
Okay. And that met criteria B3?
That was yes, B3.
Okay.
C3, inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. Well, she doesn't recall it at all because she was in a state of acute stress. C6, restricted range of affect. Example, unable to have loving feelings. But her affect has been flattened, it's blunted. She is not able to express highs and lows, and that, I believe, is a meeting of criteria C6.
Okay, let's talk about C6 for a second. So what do you talk about what do you mean when you say blunted affect?
A person's emotional range becomes very constricted. From the highs of excitement to the lows of depression, it seems to be very, very constricted, and the person comes across as being emotionless.
Is that how somebody expresses themselves? Is that what
That's
you
the
mean?
best they can do.
Well, that's what I mean. When you talk about their range of emotion, are you talking about how they express themselves?
Yes, how they express themselves.
Okay, so is that something that you notice when you're talking to patients?
Oh, absolutely. That's, yeah. We always make a comment about their affect and their mood in the mental status part of the report. It's the first thing we see.
Okay, so that's what you mean by I'm sorry, blunted affect, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what was the other part that you mentioned with
D3.
C6?
And there,
With C6, there was something else.
C6 and D. D3, difficulty concentrating. Well, actually, there's one more. There was D4 as well. I guess I left it out of my report.
Okay.
Which was hypervigilance. Being she used to be a very sound sleeper. That was reported early on in her diaries regarding some activities between Mr. Alexander and her. And she became very hypervigilant at the jail, easily awakened at night, and had difficulty falling asleep at times.
Now, how do you know the difference between the fact that she might just be, her sleeping situation is different and it's louder? How do you know that that's not what occurred versus hypervigilance?
Well, that could account for some of it, but it seems to have occurred over a long period of time. And so there's always a period of adjustment when we move into a new situation. And jails are noisy, there's no doubt about it. But she pointed it out to me. She said that she's very easily awakened by noise in the jail. And from prior to that, she was able to sleep very, very soundly.
Okay, and is this something that has then lasted over time?
Yes, it has.
Okay, so in other words, this adjustment period of changing sleeping situations, outlasted this adjustment period.
Yeah, many people have difficulty going to sleep in a hotel room the first night or two that they're there. So that's fairly common.
Okay.
So I just realized this now. I should have also listed as D4 as the criteria.
Okay, and that's the hypervigilance, right?
Right.
Okay. And what was the next criteria?
That was it.
Oh, I thought you said D5.
Well, exaggerated startle response. I didn't see that much. But,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So how many criteria do you have to have before you can diagnose somebody with PTSD?
Well, and for criteria A, you need both of the following, which you did. For criteria B, one or more of the following, and there were 5. C, 3 or more of the total of 7 that exist. And D, 2 or more of the 5 that exist.
All right, C, you said there's 3 or more?
I beg your pardon?
With C, there's 3 or more that you have to use?
3 or more, yes.
Okay, and what are I have C3 and C6.
Oh, yes, you're right. Gee whiz, I don't know what happened there. Okay, hold on. Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. That should have been C5.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Not being able to connect all that well, feeling detached from reality, not being able to deal with the reality of the situation would account for some of the stories that were made up in the beginning.
Okay. All right.
Judge, he's writing on an exhibit. I would ask that he not do that, please.
Actually, I don't think that's the exhibit that he's writing on.
That's the report.
Yes, sir, if you're marking on a document that is...
Oh, no, this is my copy.
All right,
I left you a copy there.
all right, you may proceed.
All right, so based on these criteria, that's what tells you, and, okay, then let me go back to the test then. So how do the tests that you perform bolster this, what? Do you
Excuse
need
me?
to stop?
Can I
Yep.
say, yeah, I also,
I'm going to object, there's not a question in front of him, and so he can't.
Sustained.
What did you want to say?
I wanted to say that she also meets criteria C7, which is a sense of foreshortened future. She was thinking about suicide for the longest period of time.
Okay. All right. And is that something that she discussed with you when you first met with her?
Yeah, so we talked about that from the earliest times because it's always a suicidal risk, so you have to be careful about that.
Okay. All right. The scales on the PTSD test, what do they do to confirm what you just told us?
Okay, now coming at this from a different perspective, the test is designed to ask the individual if they can identify certain symptoms or certain experiences that they have had. And a statement is in the question item, and they circle on an answer sheet the particular items that they identify with. And once that is done for the, I think, 5 different sections on the test, I have to add them up, determine if it meets the criteria, which are very specific. She met all 5 criteria, therefore meeting the DSM diagnostic criteria for PTSD. It's not quite as specific as this, but it's just a different way of looking at the same problem. And it also measures the severity of the symptoms as reported by the individual. And in that case, she indicated what they were and what it was. And so that was another confirmation. Also on the Milan test, the 2 highest elevated scales were the post-traumatic stress disorder scales and the anxiety scale, anxiety being a major component of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that was yet a second confirmation of the diagnosis.
Okay, and when you talk about high elevated scales, what does that mean?
Well, that's a good point. I should have to be careful when I say that. The test generates an output from the computer. And can I hold it up to the jury and show them what it looks like? Or it's like a bar graph. It's a bar graph. And on one side is a score, and on the other side are the different categories. And there are scores for paranoia, schizophrenia, antisocial characteristics, and a whole range of them. Of those variables, anxiety is one scale, and PTSD is another. And the 2 highest elevations of those scales was the PTSD scale and the anxiety scale. And this was something that was scored electronically so that you know, it was like a second opinion to me.
Okay, so that further confirmed the PTSD.
Yes.
All right. Now you talked a little bit about. Whether or not, well, can a person who causes the trauma, so let's go back to the criteria A1, right? That's the trauma, experiencing a trauma. So what if the person is the one who causes the trauma?
Well, recent research in the past 10 years has shown a report of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in individuals who perpetrate crime. I have a couple of articles that show this, if it's okay to show them.
Did you prepare a PowerPoint slide to help explain it?
I did.
All right. So, and I think some of your examples talked about like a police officer who shoots somebody.
That's correct.
Okay.
And a
so
soldier.
Or a soldier who is killing the enemy.
That's correct.
All right. So in those types of situations, they would be the one who are, I guess, would you say
The
that they're
perpetrators of the act.
the perpetrators. Okay. So what does research tell you about the perpetrators of an act with regard to PTSD?
Okay. This is relatively new, so I could only find a couple of articles. If I look deeper, I'm sure I could find more, but there's a law of diminishing returns. In this one particular study...
Oh, Judge, I'm sorry. Can I publish this slide?
You may.
In this one particular study, they were looking at a population of mentally ill perpetrators. Now, this is not to say that Ms. Arias is mentally ill, but this is where the data comes from, and we have to do the best we can with the data. But I have another article that shows something similar.
Okay.
But in mentally ill perpetrators, these are people that were hospitalized after the commission of the crime, who committed an act of homicide. Of the 29 in the group, granted it's small, 19 were assessed by the PTSD scale, and they discovered that lifetime prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder following homicide was 58%. So 58% of this particular population, which is not an average population, I must admit, had symptoms, had PTSD diagnosed, whereas another 21% had partial PTSD. They didn't have all the criteria, but they had many of the criteria.
Okay. All right. Can you go to the next slide? And what does this article tell us?
Now, this is another story, another article about intrusive memories of perpetrators of violent crime. Now, these were not necessarily all involved with killing, because some of the victims were just seriously harmed. But 46% of the 105 young offenders, these were people under 30, reported distressing intrusive memories, which is a symptom of PTSD, while 6% were diagnosed with PTSD. So not as high as the mentally ill group, but still a significant number of people, suggesting that perpetrators of violent crime are subject to developing PTSD symptoms. So the fact that Ms. Arias was a perpetrator of a horrendous crime is not out of step with my diagnosis of her having PTSD.
Okay. So, so in other words, and when you say perpetrator, in other words, she's the person, she's admitted that she's the one who killed Travis.
She admitted.
And we're not talking about the reasons why, okay,
Right.
at this point. But based on that fact alone, it's still very possible that she can suffer from PTSD just because she's the one who did the killing.
Yes, and again, having worked with a population where violence was involved with police officers and so forth, I can attest to the fact that the percentages are probably a little bit higher than this particular study, but I wasn't doing a study, so I can't report my data.
Okay. And when you said, you mentioned your study with, or you're working with police officers, and working with police officers, and in those situations, obviously they weren't considered necessarily crimes when a police officer shot somebody.
That was the traumatic experience.
Okay. And so you were working with those police officers with regard to their traumatic experiences.
Yes. For example, I remember one patient that I had, but not a police officer, who killed someone during a hunting accident. And he became so laden with post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that he required leaving work and going on disability. He was that negatively affected. Now, that's only one case that I'm reporting to you. But the fact of the matter is it happens. I've seen it. The data supports it.
All right. And with regard to you working with police officers and working with PTSD in general, how much experience do you have working with PTSD?
Well, when I was doing my forensic work back east, I had a lot of medical malpractice cases, many of which involved medical injury due to surgical procedures. And many of those individuals developed PTSD as a result of their injuries. Because they develop all kinds of disabilities, problems in living, obsessing about the anger at the doctor, and so on and so forth. Now, they didn't all meet that criteria, but quite a few did meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, and what other experience do you have working with post-traumatic stress? And is that just the
People
only-
that were involved in accidents, injuries, fire. Patient I had was involved in the MGM fire years ago, and he lost his lover and suffered terribly from post-traumatic stress disorder because he felt they were trapped on a floor and the other fellow died and he couldn't save him. These are the kinds of traumatic situations that can bring about post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right, and in terms of years, how long have you been working with post-traumatic stress?
Well, probably from the time that I began, maybe my first couple of years I didn't have cases like that, but over 30 years.
Okay. All right. I think that was it for the slide.
That's it for that slide.
All right. I want to ask you about PTSD and acute stress. Do they have anything to do with each other?
They do. Usually acute stress, an acute stress disorder, may I define what it is?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, let's go to your DSM and define acute
Okay.
stress.
The diagnostic criteria for an acute stress disorder. The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. And two, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Those are the, okay. And then criteria B.
Okay.
They ask for 3 or more out of the following 5. Here are the 5. A subjective sense of numbing, detachment, or absence of emotional responsiveness. A reduction in awareness of his or her surroundings, being in a daze. Derealization, depersonalization, and dissociative amnesia.
Okay, let me stop you there. Derealization and depersonalization, what are those things?
Okay, depersonalization, when a person feels outside of their own body. They don't feel in contact with themselves. They feel like they're floating, spacey.
Okay.
Derealization is being disconnected from the environment per se and just functioning with themselves as the entire world, trying to maintain the reality as best as they can.
Okay.
Dissociative amnesia, we indicated, occurs because during periods of acute stress, the hippocampus does not form the memories that it does. We explained that before, and so dissociative amnesia is very common during this particular disorder.
Can I ask you something about that?
Sure.
Hippocampus, when it doesn't form the memories, are those memories ever available?
No.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. C, the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following ways: recurrent images, thoughts, dreams, illusions, flashback episodes, or a sense of reliving the experience, or distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event. I'm sorry. I'll reread that?
Yes, please.
The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following ways: recurrent images, thoughts, dreams, illusions,
Go
flashbacks,
slower.
or a sense of reliving the experience, or distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event.
Okay. Can you explain to us generally what does that mean?
Well, basically that means that a person re-experiences the event somehow. Either they'll have a bad dream, several bad dreams, they'll have recurrent thoughts about the situation, they'll have illusions, they may see shadows moving that remind them of it, they may have flashback episodes of the actual crime, or they may sense that they're reliving the experience, or they may have distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event. Now, that, in my feeling, was one of the reasons why the story was made up to keep her distance from having to be reminded of her involvement in the traumatic event. D, marked avoidance of stimuli that arouse recollections of the trauma, blocking of thoughts, feelings, conversations, activities, places, and people. Another characteristic of the story.
When you talk about story, doctor, you're talking about like the intruder story.
The intruder story. I'm sorry,
Basically,
I'll be more specific.
That's okay. Basically, Miss Arias' denial.
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. Marked symptoms of anxiety or increased arousal, difficulty sleeping, irritability, poor concentration, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, and motor restlessness. Okay, and we only need, okay. Then, the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of life, or impairs the individual's ability to pursue some necessary task, such as obtaining necessary assistance, which was clearly obvious here, or mobilizing personal resources by telling family members about the traumatic experience.
Well, so what's clearly
She was not able to
obvious?
tell her family about what happened. She was not able to tell anybody about what happened. And this is a classic symptom of an acute stress disorder.
How do we know that she wasn't able to tell anybody versus she just doesn't want to get into any trouble?
Well, I guess that could be an alternative explanation, but when something horrible like that happens, can you imagine the feeling of isolation if you can't turn to a parent, if you can't turn to a friend, if you can't turn to a professional to seek some help? The turmoil must have been incredible. So I consider that to be a significant indication that she suffered from that disorder. The disturbance lasts for a minimum of 2 days and a maximum of 4 weeks, and occurs within 4 weeks of the traumatic event, and that fits. The disturbance is not due to the direct physiological effects of a substance like drug abuse or medication, or a general medical condition, is not better accounted for by a brief psychotic disorder. We saw no indications of that, and is not merely an exacerbation of pre-existing Axis 1 or Axis 2 disorders. So
Okay.
she, in my opinion, experienced an acute distress disorder. Since you can't use that diagnosis for more than a month or two, you then have to switch to post-traumatic stress disorder if those other symptoms exist. And by the time that I evaluated her over a period of time, she manifested or verbalized to me all of the symptoms that I indicated
Of PTSD.
of PTSD.
Okay, so you said that with regard to diagnosing somebody with acute stress, you said that it can't be diagnosed unless you're talking or meeting with them at the time that it's going on. Is that
Within
right?
about a month or so of the incident, maybe 2 months.
Okay, and so because you didn't speak to Miss Arias until, I think, December of 2009,
Yes.
can you make a diagnosis with acute distress?
No, but you can indicate, you can more or less suggest that it probably happened based upon what I heard from
Okay,
her.
and acute stress, you said that because it only lasts for so long, because the diagnosis can only be given for so long, up to 4 weeks, does it typically go into something else?
It typically, if it continues, it's usually post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, so in other words, when you say continues, if there's criteria still existing, it usually is manifest into PTSD?
Yes, the criteria change from acute stress disorder to post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are similarities and overlaps.
Okay.
So it fit. It fit the diagnosis.
All right, and with regard to, so we have post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's something, is that something that you can diagnose by speaking with her and everything that you've told us about?
And the test results, yes.
Okay. With regard to the acute stress, what does that do, not just the memory of what happened on June 4th, does that have any memory issues with regard to 2 to 4 weeks out?
A person could still have some difficulty formulating clear memories because the hippocampus may still be influenced by the flood of adrenaline and other chemicals that interfere with its ability to create memories. Now, during the flooding, the physiological flooding of the hippocampus and the other areas of the brain involved with memory, we would begin to see it dissipating after the trauma dissipates, goes away. But the impact may remain for some time. But gradually, the chemicals dissipate, they're flushed out, and the memory capabilities are restored. And so what may happen is that some memories can be retained and formed anew, but they may not be clear. They may be foggy. They may be snapshots in the brain, or they may even be confused in some way. But this is not at all uncommon.
To have the spotty memory?
Yeah, because memory it's not like a switch on the wall where it's off 1 minute and on the next. It's a gradual and not necessarily smooth improvement.
Okay. Judge, may we approach?
And that is all for today. Monday, 10 o'clock. Anyone who cannot be here at 10 o'clock. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice weekend. You are excused.
Please stand to the jury.
Your Honor, can I take this back? I can do this over the weekend. I'll bring it back.
Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Please be seated. Dr. Samuels, you're asking to have those items returned to you, correct?
I'll bring it back on Monday. Well, tomorrow, actually, I'll bring it back with me. Okay? Thanks.
DSM and the PTS test.
Oh, yes.
Back to Ms. Wilmot. Counsel, anything else for today? See you tomorrow. Thank you.
What do you want?
We're adjourned.